This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The podcast, though, we're here, as the title suggests, to talk of the stories of films. It's radical, right? So what I tend to look at is production stories, development stories, little behind-the-scenes tales, little small nuggets that kind of push the direction of a film slightly and go to make the films that we know and love pretty much just that, the films that we know and primarily love. The films I choose for this podcast tend to have more of a mainstream leaning than not. They're a bit in line with my interests as well. I tend to focus on films that I have some degree of interest in. One thing I don't do on this podcast is snark. There are lots of other podcasts available if that is what you're hunting for. If you're still here, you're very, very welcome. Thank you for supporting me. And I'm going to crack on with the first of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going to do a festive one. I'm going to take you back to 1988 and I'm going to play you a clip just to get you in the mood.
Acid rain. Drug addiction. International terrorism. Freeway killers. Now, more than ever,
It is important to remember the true meaning of Christmas.
Don't miss Charles Dickens' immortal classic, Scrooged. Your life might just depend on it.
That then was a clip from 1988's Scrooged, directed by Richard Donner. The writing credits for this one, it was credited to Mitch Glazer and Michael O'Donoghue, although the source novel was obviously Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, not that that's overtly credited until the end credits of the film. In terms of the cast of this one, then Bill Murray takes the lead. There's Karen Allen, John Forsythe, John Glover, Bobcat Goldthwait in there, David Johansen, Carol Kane, Robert Mitchum with a memorable cameo, and Alfre Woodard as well as Lee Majors, also with a pretty major cameo in it. But the project, well, it wasn't an easy one to come together, nor was it renowned. It was pretty renowned for not being a particularly fun shoot either. And the idea had been floating around, but go back to 1984 when Bill Murray had that extraordinary success with the first Ghostbusters film. And it pretty much, even though he was a star up to that point, Ghostbusters was Columbia's biggest film ever at that point. It was a huge hit out of nowhere. No one really saw it coming to the level that it escalated to. But in the aftermath of it, well, Bill Murray wasn't hugely comfortable with the fame that it brought with it, and he elected to take some time away from acting and some time away from the screen. And that time continued and continued and continued. And it would be a 4-year gap between Ghostbusters and Scrooged, but even then it took a bit of persuading to get it back to Scrooged in the first place. So the story was that this first came up as an active project around 1986, and that Murray gave an extensive interview to Starlog magazine, which is available online to have a look at, around the time of the film's release, that said in that 4-year gap that he was actively looking for work. He wanted to make film, but he wasn't finding good scripts. He wasn't finding stuff that he was particularly interested in. And one of those offers that came to him was Scrooge, which was set up at Paramount, and that was one that he rejected as well. But ultimately, it was one that he decided to come back to. Although when he did come back to it, he would do a lot of work reworking that screenplay. So the script for the film lay in Saturday Night Live veterans Michael O'Donoghue and Mitch Glazer. They penned the screenplay for the movie, and the idea of a modern day Ebenezer Scrooge tale with a kind of snarky lead to it. Oh, I do a bit of snark. There you go. Was quite a compelling one, particularly when Bill Murray's name was brought into the mix for the first time. Now, Nick de Semmelin of Empire Magazine has written a really excellent book that I recommend called Wild and Crazy Guys, which talks about the comedy stars of the 80s. And in that book, he tells the story of Richard Donner and Bill Murray's first meeting that really accelerated Scrooge as a project. Because Donner, it's worth noting at this point, he was just coming off Lethal Weapon. He'd done The Goonies, he'd done The Omen, he'd done Superman, and he was very much a go-to director. And he tells the story of he was interested in doing Scrooge, and so one night he asked Bill Murray to come round to his Los Angeles home, and they would talk about it. Now, Bill Murray had a reputation for never really turning up on time, and true to form, he didn't turn up on time. So he was due at Donner's house at 6 o'clock, and Donner sat there and waited and waited and waited and waited. And it wasn't until just gone 9 that Murray finally knocked on the front door, and he and Donner had a few hours sitting down talking about Scrooged, what they wanted to do with it. And it was at that point Donner said he definitely wanted to do it. He definitely wanted to do it with Murray. Getting Murray on board was still a little bit complicated, and it wasn't cheap. That he would be paid, and this is hefty by 1980s standards, $6 million for his lead role in the movie. But crucially, he wasn't happy with the screenplay at all, and he would go back and work with O'Donoghue and Glazer to reshape the script. In fact, going back to that Starlog interview I talked about before, Murray explicitly says, "We tore up the script so badly that we had parts all over the lawn." And so Murray brought particular ideas to the film of where it should go. It was down to him that we get the romantic angle between his character of Frank and Karen Allen's Claire. And eventually they got to a point where there was a script in place that they were happy with, that they were happy to pursue. Paramount duly stumped up the requisite budget for the film, and it was a go project. Now, it was a sizable project for a comedy as well, that notwithstanding Murray's $6 million salary in the first place, the film itself would cost over $30 million to make, which for a studio comedy in the 80s was a lot of money. But then it required extensive sets to be built, and there were the logistics of the special makeup effects and the work that needed to be done to realise the ghosts in the film as well. There are also some fairly challenging flying sequences that I'm going to come back to a little bit later. Nonetheless, the green light was given, and production on Scrooged would begin in December 1987 and would go through to April 1988. But the actual production of the movie was beset by some significant challenges, primarily human challenges. Now, Donner, let's go back to Richard Donner, and there are stories of Richard Donner sets being really delightful film sets. I remember there's a story of the film Assassin with Sylvester Stallone and Antonio Banderas, which the Wachowskis were involved with, of course. And I remember the interviews off the back of that film coming out saying what a great happy set it was, how much fun everyone had. Same with Maverick as well. Assassin, not a great film. Maverick I enjoy enormously, but Donner's sets were notorious for being quite jocular and upbeat. But he'd never directed a comedy talent like Bill Murray before, and Murray very improvisational, that he was very set in his mind of how he wanted to do stuff, and more to the point, how he didn't want to do stuff. And it was two alpha figures really that were going head to head. And so Donner would say, I mean, he was quoted as saying, quote, "You don't direct Billy, you pull him back." And there were quotes floating around, unusually as the film was readying for release, about just what a testing production this had been. Now, Murray as well, it's worth noting that he felt the pressure of this project, because even though he'd enjoyed numerous successes in films, Stripes, Ghostbusters, etc., he hadn't been really the sole lead of a film. He'd been billed above the title of a movie, but this film rested on his shoulders, to the point where most of the supporting cast just have very, very small roles in the film, and they come in and out, whereas it's Murray who's the consistent figure on screen for the vast bulk of it. If you go back to Ghostbusters, it's shared amongst an ensemble. Here, he was doing the heavy lifting pretty much by himself in terms of performance. And so he was open about how much he didn't enjoy that at all. So this was a production that was recreating Christmas on studio sets for months. And really at the start of 1988, when in that January to April period where people just don't feel particularly Christmassy at all. And Murray said, quote, "I was by myself really, that those supporting players would come in, they would do excellent work, but they will come in, but most of the time he just found himself alone, and he just said Scrooged was a miserable gig. He didn't enjoy it." And he said, quote, "I was trapped on a dusty, smelly and smoky set in Hollywood for 3.5 months, having a lousy time by myself and just coughing up blood from the fake snow that was falling all the time." It would be fair to say that it wasn't just Bill Murray who wasn't having an awful lot of fun on the movie. Carol Kane, one of his co-stars, was opening an interview, although she's given subsequent interviews where she talks about how she enjoyed making Scrooge. But around the time, the story was that her ghost, who regularly had to pummel and hit Murray, she just wasn't having fun, and she would find it quite emotional and upsetting to do. Not helped, I would imagine, by just how intense the shoot sounded like it was. Murray, in the aftermath of the film too, would open up about the level of disagreement he'd had with Richard Donner on the movie. Now, the legendary late film critic Roger Ebert notoriously gave the film a 1-star review. And I think he described it as the worst adaptation of A Christmas Carol he'd seen. I disagree with Roger Ebert on that, but nonetheless, he interviewed Murray afterwards, which is fascinating in its own side because they openly talk about the fact he gave it a 1-star review. But Murray opened up there about, he said that could have been a really, really great movie. The script was so good, and most people, when Carol Kane and Karen Allen did a recent article with Vulture looking back at the film, they were saying the same thing. The script was really, really good, but going back to what Murray said, quote, "There's maybe one take in the final movie that is mine. We made it so fast it was like doing a movie live. He," and that's Richard Donner, "kept telling me to do things louder, louder, louder. I think he was deaf." And the story goes that, the two of them were not in tandem on the shooting of the film. So going back to what Karen Allen was talking about in her recent Vulture interview, she said that they would be shooting it in New York at 5:30 in the morning in winter, and that Murray would turn up and he would go into the track and he would say to Richard Donner he was struggling with the scene, and so Donner would go in and talk to Murray, and they would try and work the scene out, and the writers would come in, and the crew would be just outside in the cold whilst they were trying to nail the scenes that they were trying to get, and that was before they'd started shooting a frame on a given day. There were significant technical challenges too, and Dan Cooper on the Film Stories YouTube channel talked about Scrooge last year, and that's available at youtube.com/filmstories. There you go, subtle plug there. But he found a story, and a really interesting one, about the struggle of getting Carol Kane's Ghost of Christmas Present to fly on screen. And the reason it was difficult is because Richard Donner wanted it to look very overt, that you go back to the days when he was making Superman the movie, and the trick there was to make the flying look seamless, and which he did. In this case, because what they were doing was a television production within the film itself, Donner wanted a look where you could see the strings that were helping to make Carol Kane fly in this particular instance. But as it turned out, that was really hard to do, to light a scene, to make the strings overt, to make the cables overt, was something they really, really, really struggled with. And it's the great irony that he was trying to do something that in theory should have been a lot easier than the flying sequences he mounted in Superman the movie, but by trying to make them look very, very obvious, he found himself up against an even bigger, in its own way, technical lighting challenge. There was a lot of improvisation on the set. That's also worth noting, that Murray, again, is known for his improvisational work, and as a consequence there were some moments of joy that came through that in the final cut of the film. And if you go to the incredible song at the end of the movie, and it's a really delightful moment in the film, over the end credits, this isn't a spoiler for the ending, Murray starts turning to the audience. I remember going to watch this when it came out as well, and sadly there were only about 5 or 6 in it it people in the cinema where I went to see it, because I saw it the week after Christmas, which wasn't particularly advised. But nonetheless, there's a bit where Murray just starts talking straight to the camera, and just, you know, the people on the left, you start singing, the people on the right, and he just improvised that on the spot as more and more of the crew get pushed into shot. And that was Richard Donner pushing, just going with the flow, just this remarkable denouement that Murray improvised, and just helping realise that, just making sure that there are people in the background that could make the big moment work. And so that there were moments that were captured within the production of the movie like that, where the whole process between Murray and Donner really worked. It's worth noting there's some terrific cameos in there. I did say that right at the start, but they took a little bit of persuading to do. That it was Lee Majors appears near the start in the trailer for The Wonderful, The Day the Reindeer Died, and he was asked directly by Richard Donner to take part. Robert Mitchum, meanwhile, well, he was slightly trickier to get involved in the film, because he plays Preston Rhinelander in the movie, and he had apparently turned the role down, but then Donner put him in a room with Bill Murray, and Bill Murray was the one who persuaded him that he should actually take this really small role in the film, and that it would have some impact, and that was pretty much correct. Now, the film ultimately got into the can, so they finished shooting it in the April of 1988, and the release date, they had a bit of time to get to the release date. Obviously, this was going to be a Christmas release, and the film was due to premiere in mid-November 1988, ahead of its wide American release on the 23rd of November of that year. Interestingly, the UK release was only 2 days behind. It was on the 25th of November, and this was at a point where staggered release dates internationally were far more commonplace, but then again, they were selling a Christmas film, so what could you do? But the post-production was still tricky, primarily because there was a lot of footage shot. And again, Murray talked about this when he was chatting to Starlog. He said, quote, "We shot a big, long, sloppy movie, so there's a great deal of material that didn't even end up in the film." And that missing material continues to be something of a mystery as well. I'll come back to that just in a second. Let's just deal quickly with the actual release of the film. Now, the movie was clearly a big one for Paramount. It released it into US cinemas at the end of November 1988, and it was a hit. It wasn't a monster hit. It wasn't the size of Ghostbusters or anything like that, but it opened at number one at the US box office with $13 million. It knocked The Land Before Time off the top slot. That had opened the week before, and the other big opener of that week was Cocoon: The Return. I must get to Cocoon on this podcast at some point. But it was a hit, and it would be on its way to earning $60 million at the global box office, at the US box office, with more overseas. So it would be a profitable film for Paramount, and what's more, it would for Bill Murray mark a return to the screen, and he would take on several projects consequent to it. So number one was Ghostbusters 2, that he moved from Scrooged onto making. He would follow it with Quick Change. He would go on to do Groundhog Day, and it would be a bit of a purple patch for his career. In terms of Richard Donner, well, the story goes that he and Murray never spoke again, really, after the film was released, that they were quite happy to go their separate ways. And it wasn't just Murray that went to a big sequel to one of his previous films. Donner went from making Scrooged onto making Lethal Weapon 2. But let's go to some of that missing footage and kind of little bits of ongoing legacy, because for a start, Danny Elfman's score for the movie didn't get a release until 2011. There was and even then it was quite limited, but that took an awful long time just to release the music for it. But more interestingly, and that's not denigrating Danny Elfman's excellent score, I'm a huge fan of Danny Elfman, was the missing DVD release of Scrooged, because this hinted at an awful lot more, and yet ultimately never appeared. Because announced in 2006, pretty much at the peak of the DVD boom, was a new special edition of Scrooged, and this was called the You'll Love It edition. And so the announcement of this came in the summer of 2006, and a release date in America was announced of October the 31st, 2006. In fact, I'm looking at the old press release now. But what's interesting about this release is it has the list of a whole bunch of extra features that were due to be included on this special edition DVD. So once you get past the technical bits and bobs about the audio, the subtitles, the widescreen version, top of the list of I'd really like to listen to that was a commentary track that was recorded by Richard Donner. Now, whether he did or did not ever record this commentary track, I can't tell you, but it sounds like there was a strong chance that that he did actually record a track. And given how many of the stories of Scrooged really feel like they're still to be told about just what discomfort there was on that set, that would be fascinating to listen to. There's some fairly standard looking featurettes in there as well. Christmas to Remember, updating Ebenezer, bringing the ghost to life, the look of Scrooge. But also on that extra features list was a two-part featurette called On the Set with Bill Murray, and part 1 and part 2. And again, this is likely to have dug into quite a lot of the improvisational work that Murray was doing on the set of Scrooge. There was also listed on the extra features a Show West message from Murray. And what Show West is, if you're unaware, is it's basically a trade show for cinema exhibitors where movie stars and studios go along and try and persuade cinemas and cinema chains to take their film. So Murray went and did some kind of presentation or message for the Show West convention in that year, and that was also going to be included, as well as the theatrical trailer for the movie. It got so far down the line that the box art for this was released. The box art is available online if you have a search around for it. People started taking pre-orders, but what there wasn't was ever an outright cancellation notice for this. It wasn't a case of anyone ever announced it was delayed or anything like that. It was just a case of that release date came and went, and there was no sign of the disc. Nothing happened. What did happen instead is, and it's around 2011, 2012, we finally got a Blu-ray edition of the movie, which again had 1080p, upgraded transfer, etc., etc. But on this one, all you got for your money was a theatrical trailer. Now, when a film is set for release on DVD and Blu-ray in the UK, those extra features have to be classified by the British Board of Film Classification. And I queried its website, and I did find evidence of a slightly longer cut of the film that was classified in 2012. So the running time of Scrooge, 97 minutes, and there's a classified version of it that goes for 103 minutes and 41 seconds that Paramount classified, that upped it from a PG to a 12 certificate in the UK. But again, where that footage is, I've no idea. It's very well known that there was lots of footage shot that didn't make it into the final cut of the film, but whether we'll ever get a chance to properly take a look at that, well, it remains to be seen, really. The reviews when Scrooge came out were not very much in its favour. I mean, the aforementioned Roger Ebert and his review of giving it 1 star, saying it's one of the worst adaptations of A Christmas Carol he'd seen, that was at one end. There was some liking for Murray's performance. Some people really went for it. But like a lot of Christmas films, it's really endured. I mean, we're seeing at the moment Last Christmas has had some pretty hostile reviews, and I really quite like that. I like that film. But nonetheless, I sense that's the kind of film as well that will build an audience over time. In the case of Scrooge, that's certainly what's happened. That even though Bill Murray doesn't appear to be that keen on the film, even though Richard Donner doesn't talk about it an awful lot, it regularly polls quite well when there are votes for finest Christmas films or favourite Christmas films. And also, of course, the story of A Christmas Carol has been told so many times, but no one's really done it in quite as caustic a way. I mean, Robert Zemeckis did an animated version that I thought was under the Disney banner, which I thought was really terrifying, really scary and really dark. Scrooge was just a wonderful showcase of the talents of Bill Murray and what he could do with that central character. And whilst the film has flaws, I do think there's an awful lot of fun with it. I do also think it sort of stands alone in its own way as well. So not massively loved when it came out, far more liked now, a huge sing-song worth joining in at the end, but still some mysteries surrounding this one. Which brings me to the halfway point of the latest episode of Film Stories. So permit me to do my usual array of plugs. I am a fully independent publisher. I have no, I wish I had a huge company with lots of money behind me. I don't. It's just me in a room. Therefore, anything you can do to help me push the word out is so appreciated. I can't tell you. So if you can subscribe to this podcast, for instance, algorithms apparently like that. If you can leave me nice reviews, algorithms like that as well. I also publish Film Stories magazine, which is a monthly print film magazine, printed here in the UK and made here in the UK, where there's so much mainstream joy in there, and also we give lots of opportunities to new filmmakers and new writers. The new issue is, as this podcast is being released, I'm getting it back from the printers. On the front is Karen Gillan, and she talks to me exclusively, and we do a huge interview in the magazine about her directorial debut, The Party's Just Beginning. You can order a copy of that at www.filmstories.co.uk. But I've waffled. Let me get on with the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories, and I'm coming right up to the present day. Let's have a film from 2019. Here's a clip.
How long we known each other, Ken? I ever break a promise to you? I will put you in the driver's seat at Le Mans if you just shut your mouth and let me do my thing. All right. Come here.
Morning, Shelby.
Morning, Molly.
Up yours.
I'll go to hell.
Right then, well, depending where you are in the world, that was either a clip from Le Mans 66 or from Ford v Ferrari, a 2019 movie that's directed by James Mangold. The screenplay for this one is credited to Jez Butterworth, John Henry Butterworth and Jason Keller. The cast list: Matt Damon, Christian Bale, John Berthel, Catriona Balfe, Josh Lucas, who's an absolute hoot in it, really like, and a really big ensemble cast for the movie. And this is the film, as the American title certainly suggests, that tells the story of the Ford Motor Company in the 1960s decided to take on Ferrari for the Le Mans racing championship. The reason I mean, I really like this film a lot. I've seen it twice now, and I think this is the kind of film that the current Hollywood studio environment is likely to make less and less and less, and it's one of the very last films to be greenlit by 20th Century Fox before it was bought up by Disney. However, the story of trying to get this project off the ground actually goes back 10 years, so it's been in development for really some time. And so if we go back to 2009, that's when Michael Mann, of the likes of Heat, Last of the Mohicans, of course, and so many brilliant films, was circling the movie with a view to direct. And Jason Keller at this point had penned a first draft of the screenplay, and in 2009 it was Brad Pitt who was in line to star in the movie. So then we move on just a year, 2010, and at this point director James Mangold, who had scored a big success for Fox with the Oscar-winning Walk the Line, who was just wrapping up the new Tom Cruise movie for them, Night and Day. Tom Cruise, Cameron Diaz in that one. Not a massively successful film, but it did some half-decent box office numbers. And at that point, he'd got hold of the Jason Keller draft of the script, which, just as a writing sample at that point, as he would tell Screen in a recent interview. And whilst Mangold has said that he's not a motor racing person and he didn't really know the history of the story, he found himself utterly wrapped by what he was reading. So he duly inquired about the project. Could he be the one to bring this to the screen? And Fox gave him the answer: no, you can't. The problem at that point was that there were other people attached to the film, that it was at that stage Michael Mann who was going to direct the movie. Movie stars were involved as well. At the point where Brad Pitt was attached, I mean, that was seen in 2010 as pretty much heading to be a go project. However, Fox did want to work with Mangold again, and it had a slightly different problem, that Darren Aronofsky had been developing an X-Men spin-off called what would become The Wolverine, and Mangold was given the screenplay to that instead and was asked if he was interested in doing it, and that's the job he duly took. Now, in 2010, the author A.J. Bain wrote the book Go Like Hell, which was focusing on this particular rivalry between Ford and Ferrari at this point as well. And in 2011, with that book in mind, Jez and John Henry Butterworth were brought in by Michael Mann to have another look at the screenplay and to put their script for the film together. And they did get to meet with Carol, the real life Carol Shelby, before he died, to get his insights, and were able to fuse his views and perspectives into the latest draft of the screenplay that they duly put together. But even in 2011, so this had motored on chortle. This had gone on another 2 years. So Brad Pitt was still involved at this point. However, move forward a year or two, and Michael Mann was dropping out of the film. And instead, moving in his place was the director Joseph Kosinski, who's currently finishing up on the Top Gun sequel at the point that this is being recorded. Now, Joseph Kosinski had made his directorial debut in 2010's Tron Legacy, and by 2013 he was releasing his second film, Oblivion, starring Tom Cruise. Now, the project at this point was called Go Like Hell. It was indeed based on the book by Bain, and now, having just worked together on Oblivion, Kosinski was lining up Tom Cruise to star in the film with Brad Pitt to play his co-star. So ultimately, in the movie, we got Matt Damon playing Carol Shelby, and Cruise would have been in that role, and Pitt would have been in the role of Ken Miles. Would have been a bit of an Interview with the Vampire reunion then. But a couple of things were happening in 2013. That blockbuster cinema was changing, that it was going more franchise driven, that it was getting a little more risk averse. Furthermore, you couldn't really bank on a movie star to fuel your box office either. That whilst Tom Cruise had recovered his box office standing with the fourth Mission Impossible film in 2011, the days of him being able to instantly open a movie to huge numbers, well, they and not just him, most movie stars, were pretty much coming to an end. Also in 2013, Ron Howard's film Rush, another motor racing story, failed really to catch fire at the box office. Again, it did decent numbers, got good reviews, but it didn't really take off. And so in the midst of all of this, there was the attempt to get Go Like Hell going at 20th Century Fox, a film that was going to cost over $100 million to make, given the intensity of the motor racing sequels that were going to be in the movie. And with Cruise not necessarily box office gold, with the risks deemed very, very high, Fox was reticent to give this one a green light. And, Mangold was was still interested in it at this point, but at that stage, the film wasn't going anywhere. And in fact, what ultimately gave it a kickstart, because eventually Joseph Kosinski drifted away from the movie. And so we go back, we move on now a few years to 2017. And Mangold had gone from The Wolverine, which was reasonably well received, but made a fair whack of money, to doing Logan, which was a riskier take on the Wolverine character. I should do Logan in a future podcast, actually. A riskier take on the Wolverine character, a hugely successful one, and a really acclaimed Oscar-nominated film as well. And off the back of Logan, which had been a risk because that was going R-rated, that was taking the X-Men series into directions it hadn't gone, and I think it's one of the best comic book movies the last decade, personally. He had a little bit of currency with 20th Century Fox to get another project off the ground. That this was the brief moment of opportunity that if you were going to do one that you really wanted to do, the studio was listening, and he took that opportunity. And he had two films in mind. He was still very, very interested in bringing the Go Like Hell story to the big screen, but also that one, the conversation was still centered around money. That was still going to be a really expensive film to make, and so he decided to do one that on the surface looked lower risk. He was going to do a biopic of Patty Hearst, and he brought in writers Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski, who've just penned Dolomite Is My Name, really excellent film. I also did Ed Wood. I mean, they've just got such pedigree, a terrific pair of writers, and they were putting a screenplay together based on a book by Jeffrey Toobin. But the problem with this one, even though it was a lower budget film that Mangold was chasing making, was Patty Hearst turned on the book. That the subject of the movie all of a sudden was loudly objecting to basically the text that it was going to be based on. And as a consequence of that, they got cold feet on that project, that one drifted away. And so Mangold again had one more go at investigating the Go Like Hell project. That this was, again, his moment to make a film that he really wanted to drive through the system. And there is always the argument that generally it takes one person with absolute drive sometimes to push a boulder up a hill. And in this case, it was Mangold's persistence and remembering the project that he'd really fallen for 7-8 years before that really got this one going. He had a clearer path. Fox was still interested. It put development money into this. It had paid for lots of scripts. It had had big movie stars attached at one point, so there was clearly some pedigree. Michael Mann at this point was separately looking at developing a biopic of Enzo Ferrari that Christian Bale was circling with a view of playing Ferrari in that movie. So there was another project on the horizons as well. But Mangold was finding a way to get this one moving. And by the time it got to early 2008, Fox was at the point where it was willing to greenlight the film. Now, by this stage, it was less. Mangold had to strip this one down a little bit. It wasn't based on the book anymore, and in fact, in the credits of the ultimate movie, the source text is not cited, which suggests how far it's drifted from the book at one point that the film was more keenly based on. But Fox had imposed this condition that the film can cost no more than $100 million to make. And if you remember at this point, so this is only the start of last year, at this point, Disney was circling with a view of acquiring Fox, and Fox was greenlighting fewer and fewer pictures. And this was one of the last to get through its system before the takeover was complete. So, at this stage, also in the mix, it's worth noting that Jim Caviezel was apparently in the running to play the role of driver Ken Miles. But Mangold had another idea. He'd worked with Christian Bale on the film 3:10 to Yuma, and they were keen to work together again. Bale had drifted away from Michael Mann's Ferrari movie at this stage, given the transformation he would have to do, the physical transformation he'd have to do to take that role. And so he was drawn to the film. Matt Damon was drawn to the film also in early 2018, and this was looking like a go project. But there are ways that Mangold had to approaches Mangold had to take to bring the budget under the $100 million target that Fox had set him, and that was the condition. So the core cost of the movie, the big cost, was going to be those racing sequences. And whilst the resultant film uses some CG, the idea was to do it practically, to put the audience in the cockpit of the car as much as humanly possible. And Mangold wanted to do it almost the old-fashioned way. He was using touch points like French Connection, films of that ilk, and other such vehicularly driven movies. But to make that doable, he needed fewer sequences of that ilk in the film, and he had to pick and choose which races and which driving sequences he wanted in the film, because he needed to strip some of them away. So going very, very, very spoiler light, and he talked about this Mangold talked about this in a recent interview with Screen Magazine. There's a moment in the early stages of the film where one of the characters listens to a race that's going on a radio, and the original idea was the race that has been described in radio commentary was to be shot as a full race. But by approaching it that way round, the film was able to save $7-8 million off its budget, and all of a sudden the target, the price of the film was going to come in around $96-97 million. It was under that $100 million target. This was a go project. It was able to press on and move forward. It was still going to be a very taxing movie to make, though. It's shooting in the summer of 2018, and to capture those racing sequences, they had to piece together the ultimate Le Mans race across 5 different locations, tracks and roads in 5 different locations, and then in post-production they had to use an assortment of tricks just to standardise just the visual look of them all, to make sure that the continuity in place, that everything was where it was supposed to be, that the clocks were saying the right things at the right time. Obviously it's a 24-hour race, so the clock references are fairly vital for that. But Mangold managed to get the film into the can. He shot lots of the race sequences very much in the old-fashioned way. He shot them very low, and he shot them as close up as he could. He had stunt drivers doing the driving for them, and the cameras were basically being mounted on the cars or just inside the cars, and he really wanted to get the humanity and the speed across of the races that he was putting on the screen. There was also the small matter of the cars themselves in the film, the Fords and the Ferraris, because there was no way they were going to be able to borrow films of that ilk. They couldn't use vintage cars, any kind of historical ones that were owned by collectors, because now they're worth tens of millions of dollars. So they basically had to build up the vehicles that they used in the film as well. It's telling actually that Ford ultimately distanced themselves from the final movie. It's worth noting too that even with the film in the can, this was and is a big risky movie. As I said at the start of this segment, it's the kind of film that Hollywood studios are going to be veering away from more and more. There is no sequel, there is no franchise. This is a standalone near $100 million movie from a major Hollywood movie studio, albeit one that's been bought up since the film was greenlit. And as a consequence, it was a case really that all eyes were on the release and all eyes were on the promotion and how this film did, because if this one didn't do well, then it makes like the others that are being pitched that following its aftermath, they'll be turned down on the basis of what Le Mans 66 didn't do very well at all. However, there is a happier ending to this story, but not before another bump or two along the way. Because one of the things noted about this film is it's going out around the world with two different titles. So in the UK, in fact in most of the world, it is known as Le Mans 66, and in America it's able to go out under the name Ford versus Ferrari. And James Mangold's preferred title for the film is Ford v Ferrari. The problem he had was he didn't hatch upon that title, and he and Fox didn't agree on that title until relatively late in the process, that the name of the film was not chosen officially by the time really it had started finishing. So once they'd settled on it, I mean, it clearly wasn't going to be called Go Like Hell, but once they'd settled on it, they came up against, in the UK, a bit of a legal stumble, because they went about trademarking the name of their film, as Hollywood studios are understandably want to do. But the problem they've got is under British law, you cannot trademark the names of companies into your own trademark without the permission of those companies. Or, to put it more succinctly, if they were going to trademark the name Ford v Ferrari for their film in the UK, they had to get permission of both Ford and Ferrari. Now, in order to get permission from Ford and Ferrari, they would have to have screened the film for both of them to get their sign off on the movie. And clearly at that point, I mean, if you've watched the film, I'm not going massively spoilery here in saying that both companies might struggle with how they're depicted in certain elements of the movie. And James Mangold, in the end, by the sounds of it, was pretty adamant about the fact that he didn't want to screen it for them to get their permission, and they decided that the path of least resistance in this one was just to go with another title. And as a consequence, we have the film going out as Le Mans 66, which has led to just slightly different approach to marketing in America and in the UK. One little aside, actually, one person who was supposed to be in the film, who was apparently cut in post-production, I've read this while researching the movie, was Josh Brolin, that he'd posted on his social media channel that he was in it, and then by the time you get to the final cut of the film, Josh Brolin is nowhere to be found. However, with all of the various foibles and problems resolved, it was time to put the film out into the world. And so what Disney Fox decided to do was to premiere it at the Telluride Film Festival at the end of August 2019, where it got good reviews. It got an enthusiastic response. And for a $100 million film, what they decided to do was play the film festival circuit a little bit ahead of its release in November to get some word of mouth building up, because it's going into a packed November. I mean, already we're seeing it up against the likes of Frozen 2 at the box office, and Frozen 2 has been a box office just steamroller, really, pretty much anything in its path. So they needed to build up some word of mouth for a film like this. Just simple straightforward marketing was not going to cut it. But the word of mouth was positive, and by the time the film came round to its ultimate release in November 2019, it had a little bit of momentum behind it, and it had good reviews, and it was released on November the 15th in the US, and it duly got an opening weekend of $31 million. And that was a real result, particularly that we've had of late films like The Good Liar and Doctor Sleep and studio stuff that's not superhero-y and stuff like that, that's really struggled to cut through. And in fact, The Good Liar opened against it that same week and opened with an opening weekend of $5.6 million. The other films that it was opening, I mean, it opened up against Sony's Charlie's Angels reboot as well, and that opened with $8 million. And yet Ford v Ferrari found a way to cut through in one of the most hostile box office environments of recent times in a peak November release. And at the time of this podcast being recorded, the movie's gross is up to 90 million in the US, 76 million outside of the US, with a worldwide gross so far of $167 million, and already talk of awards and possible Oscar nominations. I think this is a film that's going to run and run and run. The downside, of course, is it's still a huge risk film. It's still the kind of film where perhaps we do need to wait for a director to have a huge success with a slightly risky take on a more conventional piece of material before a studio will afford them the currency to go off and pursue a project like this. But in the case of James Mangold, he spotted something a decade ago. He stuck with it. He kept coming back to it. He kept coming back to it. He kept coming back to it. And why not go with the cliche? He finally got it over the finish line. I, for one, am glad he did, and not just because of Christian Bale's exquisite tour of the Midlands in accent form. I can relate to that. That brings us to the end of the latest episode of Film Stories with Simon Brew. You can find me on Twitter warbling on at Simon Brew. You can find the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories Pod. We have video film stories as well at youtube.com/film stories. And one of them on there actually is an extended interview with one of the stunt drivers for Le Mans 66, Jeremy Fraught. And you can find that on our YouTube channel. We're on Facebook too, facebook.com/film stories online. That's it, though, for this episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. I'll be back soon with a few more film stories. And until then, you all take care. Bye-bye.